Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? Go ahead and text in our little chat box if you guys are here. I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving and a nice week painting. Hi, Jackie. Great. All right, I'm just opening up a new window here. Hi, Susan. Wonderful. All right. Well, welcome back. How's everyone? How did everyone's week go? With the last video and adding, you know, a little bit more detail. Hi, Angela. My voice is a little bit better now, finally. It's taken a whole other week, but I shouldn't have so much trouble this week. Hi, Matt. Hi, Susan. All right, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into it, into the critiques, because I want to make sure I give everyone enough time. Also, I know that some of you have to leave early. So at the end, I will do the Q&A. And I know, Matt, you had emailed me a couple of questions, so I'll address those at the very end. So that way, I think they're really interesting questions, so it'll be really fun to kind of go over that with everyone. And okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm not sure if Lori, are you logged in, Lori? I know you said you had to leave early, so I moved you to the front. If not, I'll start with Susan, and then when Lori comes in, I can jump back. Also, I know some of you guys were having trouble like with the lag last week. My internet's been reset, so it shouldn't have as much of a lag, but if you find that your browser is giving you the little spinning wheel, just try refreshing your page and it should catch you up with the live stream. Mine isn't doing what it was doing last week, so it should be fine. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Susan. I'm going to move Lori over because I haven't seen her in here yet. And she'll probably pop in here soon. All right, so you had a couple of questions. First off, your painting is really beautiful. I think you did a fantastic job. You captured her likeness, and you know, you have a good amount of detail in the hair. Your values are bright enough. Oftentimes, oh, sorry, it's Susan Lim, L-I-M. That's who I believe I'm critiquing right now. Yep. Sorry, there's two Susans in the class. Sorry for the confusion. So yeah, I think you did a really beautiful job, and I know a lot of you were kind of like having a little difficulty with chalkiness due to some of the pigments, and also, you know, getting your grisaille bright enough. Oftentimes that's kind of a challenge, and so every time you kind of come back into your painting with a new layer, you want to ask yourself if your painting is kind of emitting that light, especially in those lightest masses. Now, you don't want to whitewash everything. You don't want to have everything super washed out, but you do want those nice brightest highlights like here in the forehead. You want those really, really close to pure white. You don't usually need them exactly pure white because that very rarely ever happens in a painting, but you want them near white. And one of the things that I know a couple of you had asked, like, if you wanted to move into color, you know, how do you know how far you go, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I believe those were some of your questions, Susan. So you asked, how do you know when to stop or add more for your underpainting? And this kind of depends on how you plan to proceed into color. And because my voice and the holidays, I haven't had a chance to film that glazing video for you guys yet, but I will, and I'm leaving town tomorrow. It's been a little bit crazy. So I will have that ready for you guys probably by the 10th of December because I'm out of town until the 5th. There's an art renewal center opening down in Los Angeles, and I'm going down to teach a workshop. So I'll be gone for about 10 days, but as soon as I get back, I'll film that bonus video for you guys and get it out to you. So I should have that to you by like the 10th. So those of you who are wanting to move into color on top of your painting, kind of wait for that video because I'll talk about how to do that directly on top of a grisaille. Now, there are two ways you could proceed into color from a grisaille like this. You can do what I'll be showing you, which is direct glazes. And it has a more nuanced approach. Kind of, it's more similar to what they would maybe do in the Renaissance period. It's not exactly how I paint, but I have done paintings in this method. And it's very subtle, but it can have a really beautiful effect in the end. So when you're going to do direct glazes, you want your underpainting to look like a finished painting. You want all of the detail there because all you're doing beyond that is adding transparent layers. Almost imagine it like you're adding like color filters. You also want your underpainting 1 to 2 steps lighter than what you want the end result. And that's always a little tricky to gauge. But what I would suggest is that you make sure your brightest highlights and mainly the light masses are I would say at least 1 value step lighter. And the reason I'm saying that is because when you glaze skin tones, your glazes are usually pretty translucent and you're not applying like a dark blue, for example. So it's not going to darken it too much. You're usually using like amber tones or pinks, and they're not usually too dark. So if you're going to be doing glazing, then 1 to 2 value steps a little bit lighter in the light mass than what you want the end result for your painting. If you're going to do more of a semi-opaque or direct painting over your grisaille, you don't really 100% need to take it to this level. Typically what I do in my work is take it to that previous step, either the first tiling, or I will leave it in that scumble stage and then move into color afterwards. So Susan, you just asked, do you use pure white to make it the brightest? You can. If you plan to glaze color over it, you might want pure white at the specular highlight level. So for example, the highlight here on the nose, right there, this highlight, a few maybe of these areas, but you've got to be careful about putting those intensities everywhere. I actually think your painting is probably light enough for that, but you might want to just punch some of these values a little bit brighter. And it doesn't mean just because you glaze doesn't mean you can't actually paint back into the glaze and brighten those areas up again, but it's not as easy to do that, and you risk getting muddy color and kind of losing your painting. So one of the benefits of doing this grisaille approach or the tonal underpainting, is that you have all of the form. It looks like a finished painting. The only thing that doesn't exist there is, some pink in the lips, pink in the cheek, and a little bit of an amber tone, and maybe some of the cooler tones here. And those can be achieved purely with glazes, so long as your underpainting has that full finished rendering. And you can approach still life or any other subject using this technique. So to go to your second question, midtones and the imprimatura. So you asked, you saw that I had left some of the midtones as the imprimatura. I actually didn't do that. I did cover most of my midtones. Where I did leave my imprimatura showing through was in the shadow mass. and maybe a little bit coming out of the transition here, you know, just a little bit. But you don't have to worry about that maybe being remaining the imprimatura. The main thing is that if you have a lot of reflected light, like in the shadow. Now, in this photo reference, you guys didn't have that, but if you did, you want to leave some of this tone, you know, in there. If you had some reflected light, let's say along the bottom of the jaw, and that will give that luminosity and that warmth. And if you took your painting into color, you would really only be glazing the light portion of the face, and you would be leaving your shadows this natural kind of transparent brown. So let me move on to your next question. Wisps of hair. So how to make them more visible without bringing too much attention. And you also asked about painting in a background color and how do you deal with the edges between the figure and the background. Now, when I do full color portraits, I typically paint my background a little bit as I move. I usually paint it in first, but as I move around my figure, I will paint just the edges of the hair. So that way, you know, or the skin. And I don't paint very much of it. I'll just paint like a thin tile right where those two edges meet. And the reason for that is so that I can control my edge quality, so that my edges don't end up too sharp. So I'd be painting in my background and I'd bring it right up to the hairline, and then I'd paint my hair and the wisps out into it. And I might not have painted the whole portrait yet. It would be maybe an underpainting. So I would go in and work those edges all along. I'd mix up just a little basic skin tone mixed with a little bit of the background color. And of course, when I teach the full color class, I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. But that's one of the ways that you can incorporate. So since you already have this grisaille, what I would suggest doing, if you wanted to put in a color here, you could either glaze. So let's say you wanted to make it kind of like a blue-gray to complement the skin tones, then you would just take a blue glaze over this brown. It will be a little bit more neutral because of this warm undertone. If you wanted to paint more opaquely, then you mix the color that you want to apply and you bring it right up to the edge of the hair. And then you take the brown from your hair and you cut back into that, wet into wet, to blend out some of those edges. So that's how you would control your edges as you go along, because you don't want razor sharp edges where the figure meets the background. It's better to have, you know, lost and found edges. This is a great example right down here in the arm. You have a lost edge here and then a found edge here. Even though like on where there's a real dark, you know, shape meeting a lighter background, you can create softness in certain areas where it meets the background. And it can create that, you know, sense of space and bring the figure forward. Okay, and then you're asking if your painting is ready for color. I would say it is, except maybe perhaps punching those little specular highlights. And I would actually even suggest, let me pull up the image. So I do feel like she actually has a little more intense brightness here. Now it's not the same, quite the same level as we see here and like the specular highlight on the nose, but I feel like if you glazed this down as it was, it might get a little bit dark in here. And especially because this plane is almost the same value as this plane. It's coming across that way. Part of that is that this whole section is one value. So what I would do is maybe find where you can add a little bit of a light here. Not nearly as bright. And I can see that usually this is kind of curved like this. So right where the form starts to turn through that middle, that plane change, is where you'll get just a slight lighter value. And then I would suggest just bringing this up and this up a notch. That way when you glaze, it doesn't get too dark. And part of that, my logic there too, is because you have highlights here and here that are brighter than these points. So you want to bring these up to at least this value because we want to maintain that sense of fall off of light. The light's coming from up here, right? So we have the light coming from up here. So it's hitting the strongest here. It should hit the second strongest through this section, and it should hit the least strongest down here. Okay, so just make sure you're maintaining that sense of the fall off of light. And I can do a quick little paint over, just really lightly. I'm going to just pick your lightest value up here because it's not pure white. And so if you just pulled in just a little more brightness here and a little bit more where this plane, let me pull up the reference there. Yeah, you can see she has this little highlight like right in this section here. And it almost helps separate the wing of the nostril from the cheek. So I would just pull that out just a little bit, and then you might have to kind of blend it back. And then on a smaller scale, you might just build out a little bit of light in this middle mass, just to give a little bit of form to that wing of the nostril. And I do feel like there's a bit of a sharpness here in her eye. And if you look, she has a little bit more of a soft crease in her upper eyelid. So what I would suggest is, instead of having, this value here, let me grab a pen real quick. There we go. So instead of having the value here and the value in this line the same, what I would suggest is making the crease line just a slightly lighter mixed value. Maybe even slightly lighter than that. And the reason is that crease is surrounded by light, so that little shadow might be deceptively dark to our eyes, but it should have a little bit of softness. And you can find one area where maybe it's compressed a little bit more. So if I look, I should probably use a softer brush to do this. Okay, so let's say I take, and it could just be done probably with a scumble since it's so light. If you just kind of went over this with a slightly opaque, lighter value, and just soften it through this middle, because it gets darker here on the left side and it gets lighter through the middle. And then you might have to go back in and re-lighten that highlight. But you can see that gives it a little bit more of a natural softness. Hi, Lori. So don't worry, I didn't skip you. I didn't see you in here earlier, so I went ahead and did Susan's because she has to bounce out too. But I'll do yours right after this one, okay? And I see your question, Susan. So you said you have a tendency to make the eyes sleepy. A lot of that has to do with the way you have the lid hanging. I actually don't feel like her eyes look sleepy. She kind of has that look here in the portrait, so I think that's fine. I think just making that crease in her upper lid a little bit softer will help. So like I said, very subtly, so if you kind of look, the corrections I made, let me zoom in just a little bit. It's sometimes easier to be a little more obvious of the changes I made. So when I pop this up, you can see how just a subtle lightness in those cheeks, what it's doing too is it's making this plane change a little bit more obvious. So there's this plane in the head. This is where the cheeks go from being more forward and upper facing to back, right? So one of the reasons why we don't put, for example, that highlight back here is because that plane is not facing the light. These planes here are facing the light. So by popping those highlights just a little bit more, you're reinforcing that idea. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a little more subtle when I was painting it in. You could hardly see it build up, but it's a pretty dramatic difference. So if you make those two changes, then I think you would be ready for moving into color. And I'll just say it again that I didn't get a chance to film that bonus video partly because of my voice, but also Thanksgiving and family and all the craziness. But I will be filming that as soon as I get back from Los Angeles. It should be ready by the 10th. I'll be coming back on the 5th. But and I'll be filming it, but I should have it ready for you guys definitely by the 10th. Okay, so if you guys are looking to maybe do a little bit of color work, that should be a fun extra little video, and you guys can experiment on your paintings. Or if you're too nervous to experiment on your paintings, you can, do something simple and like a sphere, and then practice the glazes on a sphere. So you asked, how do you cover dark areas? You wanted to change the hair in the center. What do you mean cover? Do you mean like, how do you change the shapes? So you said in the center here. So like, you mean, do you want to change the hair shape here where it meets the forehead? Like this shape here? Oh, okay. There's different ways you can do that. What I would suggest is maybe taking a little bit of your flesh tone. I think it's just that this shape feels too solid. So what I would suggest is taking a little bit of the light color for this area and just kind of cut in. Let me grab a different brush that'll work a little better for that. So break up the shape. I think it's just too solid of a mass. So you might, even just doing that. So I would take your light tone, whatever light tone it is in that area, and I would just cut in and break up that shape. I mean, that alone made a big difference. If you're talking about like this shape here, you might do the opposite and just bring a little wisp of hair down, maybe a little thinner than that. Just bring a few. You can do a little bit of back and forth too. Like this shape here is maybe too solid, maybe add another small one next to it. A little bit of variety can make it go from feeling kind of superficial to feeling more natural. Very rarely do our hair shapes also so repetitive. So you have this shape here and then this shape here. So it might not be so much that this shape is wrong, but maybe that you have this kind of repetition here. So maybe changing this shape would be beneficial. You can make it shorter. You could just color it in dark, but it kind of has this, kind of hill shape. So maybe find a way to break that up a little bit, but you can definitely just mix the right value that matches whatever skin tone is right next to the hair, and then use that to cut into the hair. Does that make sense? It's pretty natural when we're this happens to me when I paint landscapes. I'll be painting some hills, and if I'm not really closely paying attention, all the hills become these repetitive shapes. And it's very easy to do that when we're kind of feeling lost, maybe, in what we're seeing. And so what we do is paint what we know, not what we see. And then we make it a little too repetitious. And so you could see she even has like this little curl that comes down. You can make the variety, You can kind of invent the variety. Sometimes it will happen in our photo reference that we have this odd, like repetitive shape. So try to find some variety in that, and that will help. Or you just change it to make a better painting. Yeah, it tends to happen when we're maybe feeling a little bit overwhelmed, or we're paying too much attention to the details and not looking at the bigger picture. Okay, so do you have any questions, Susan? I think your painting looks beautiful, and you're ready to move. You can even leave it this way, and it would look great on its own. But yeah, it looks good. I would just bring up those lightest areas, and um, you know, you have a nice finish on the arms. So you might consider if you paint in a background, working along the edge of this arm just a little bit to find a lost edge, like you did here. How you have something, you know, kind of lost and then found in the lower right corner. And here we kind of have a found edge all the way along. And that has to do with the outline. But that would be my only other suggestion. You're very, very welcome. Good job. You guys all did so good. I'm really happy. Okay, Lori, it is your turn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about your questions first. And then I'll kind of do the same paint over. Okay, so you had a couple of questions about liquin versus linseed oil and how that relates to fat over lean. So I know it can be confusing because there's so many different mediums out there, and it's easy when you get onto forums, or if you're on Facebook, like if you're part of some of the painting groups like traditional painting or painting best practices, it can get really, really overwhelming because everyone has an opinion on, you know, what you should and shouldn't use. And I've personally have experimented with a lot of different mediums, and you know, I might try one for a while and then I'm like, you know, this isn't quite working out for me. You know, I used to use one called Neomegalp, and what I like about it is that it's not as smelly as liquin, so it's a great alternative, and it works very similar to liquin. But I always found that it would go bad in the container, and it would turn this really like waxy, opaque color, and that makes me a little bit nervous about adding so much of it in my paint. As a general rule of thumb, you know, in terms of like making paintings that are going to last for archival, you know, painting, less medium makes a stronger painting. So the less you use a ton of medium in your mixtures, the less likely your painting's going to have problems. But that being said, if you choose a medium, kind of stick with it. Now, even though technically linseed oil it's the vehicle, what we call the vehicle in your oil paint, that's the carrier. You know, it's what holds and binds the pigments together. You don't want to oil out excessively in your painting. I think I mentioned this in the video. Only oil out the areas you're going to be painting back into with color that day. Because if you just oil out and then you don't paint back into it with actual pigment, then it creates kind of these weak binding layers in your painting, and they can cause issues down the line, especially if you're really heavy-handed with your oil. I've also seen people who oil out excessively, years down the line they're painting yellows really badly, or it leaches oil and you have like these yellow dots all over your painting. That's from oiling out excessively. So just as a general rule of thumb, only ever oil out when you're going to paint back into it. And even though you're going to, if you use something like liquin, I still recommend oiling out with linseed oil or something like, shoot, I'm forgetting the name of it. Oleogel. You know, that's basically linseed oil with silica and a little bit of wax. again, you're wanting to coat it very, very thinly. You're kind of just spreading it out over the surface, and it's always helpful to blot the excess off. So that's just something to keep in mind when you oil out. You do want to oil out every time you go back into your painting, but only in the areas you're going to be repainting for that day. Or else you might run into those issues. And it's still okay to use liquid in your paint if you need it. It's not necessary to use it all the time. I would just recommend, I use it in the underlayers to get them to dry quickly. That way I don't have these, layers underneath that are still slightly curing, and they're not dry yet. And then I'm painting over the top with glazes, for example. So before any of you guys glaze this painting, if you plan to glaze it, it's actually good to wait a couple of weeks to let your painting cure before you will add these thin glazes. And the reason is that whole fat over lean. We are making our glazes with a medium like liquid or linseed oil, but you want to make sure that underpainting is good and dry. That way you don't have this thicker painted underlayer with a thin veil of a leaner layer on top, and then suddenly that underlayer is trying to dry and flex, and that upper layer is already dry. So that's what causes cracking. I've never had a painting crack, ever, but I have seen other people's paintings crack, and usually it had to do with them using a resin in their medium. So just stay away from resin-based mediums, ones that have Damar in it. And that's like a traditional medium from, like what the old masters used, but it was not the most archival. And that's because resins are brittle and firm once they set up. So, I pretty much stick with most of the mediums from Natural Pigments, because he, the guy who owns Natural Pigments, George O'Hanlon, is very knowledgeable in, the archival nature of painting. And even he says, even though I make mediums, I still recommend you use them sparingly and always, experiment with them first. So he makes a couple of glazing mediums, and he gives a very detailed explanation of what each medium is good for. And then, so the linseed oil I use is from his. It's called Pale Drying Oil, and it's a very quick drying alkyd-based linseed oil. And that's what I use to oil out. And if my paint's really stiff, sometimes I'll just add a little oil to it. Liquid, I use it when I want my painting to dry quickly, or I use it for glazes because I want those glazes to dry quickly. I hope that answered a little bit of your question. Just as a general rule of thumb, try not to use too many different mediums in each different layer. Just kind of pick two and stick with them and experiment with them. And so long as you're painting, more lean colors underneath before you build up your upper layers, then you shouldn't have too much problem. And I know there's some artists out there who don't use burnt umber, and they don't use some of the umbers because of some of the sinking in and those issues. And so if you want to try something as an alternative to using burnt umber, you can use transparent oxide red with ultramarine blue to make your own umber, and it does not sink in. I just didn't want to confuse everyone with that because, it's a little more involved. And umber is pretty straightforward, and I've used it for years. So, Lori, you asked, would you add oil after freezing? So yeah, it depends. So if your paint is stiffening up, so that was kind of your second question, freezing your paint to make it last. A couple of different factors can go into why your paint is getting too stiff in the freezer. The first one is if you're using a lead-based white, those are just going to dry quicker. That's part of it. So if I use titanium white, those paints last forever in the freezer. Lead white can last a couple of weeks. It kind of depends on how much paint you have too. If it's just a really teeny tiny pile, it's going to kind of dry throughout it, or at least get kind of sticky over time. One thing you can do to slow the drying is to use walnut oil instead of linseed oil, and that will slow the drying, but it'll also slow the drying in your painting. And if you mixed any liquid into your paint, instead of onto your brush and then in your paint, but if you mix it into the pile, then that's going to cause it to dry quicker. So, you know, you can try a couple of different things. I've also heard, I've never done this, but I've also heard that you can save your paints by submerging your palette. Like, so let's say you have a palette of colors. I put mine onto a little piece of glass into the freezer, but you can also submerge it in water. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but you can submerge it in water, and if no oxygen can get to the paint, that's what cures oil paint. It's not drying like evaporation, the way, you know, acrylics and watercolors work. Oil paints cure by oxidization, so they absorb oxygen, and that's what cures paint. So if no oxygen can get to the paint, then it tends to cure much slower. So some artists will submerge their palette under water and then let it drip dry before they paint. The only caution I have with that is make sure it's definitely dry before you start painting, because you don't want to introduce water into your oil paints. You know, I'm not sure if you could submerge it, because I'm not 100% sure on how liquid speeds up the drying. I don't think... that would be a good experiment, Susan. Mix some liquid in and then submerge it underwater and see what happens. I'm going to assume that it's the same, because I'm not sure if liquid cures by like a chemical reaction or if it helps the paint like cure by absorbing oxygen quicker. I would actually have to ask someone that. But I know in the freezer, liquid will still... sorry, my dogs are barking. Hold on. Teddy. So, sorry guys. So, yeah, if you mix liquid in the paint, I've noticed when I've had to mix a pigment in and then I throw it into the freezer, it will still cure quicker than if I didn't. So I'm not sure if that'll work, but I might try it and just see what happens. Another thing that you can do if you don't want to experiment with submerging it underwater is to take some saran wrap, some like thicker saran wrap. I like that, the kind that's kind of like sticky and it clings. I think Glad makes it. I'm trying to remember what it's called. But it really, if you press it in around your paint piles, kind of lay it over your palette and then squeeze out the air around each pile, it'll essentially do the same thing. It's just a little messy to peel off, but you know, you can save your paint that way as well if you don't want to stick it in the freezer. And I've noticed my paint's very stiff when I first bring it out of the freezer, and then suddenly, you know, over time it'll kind of loosen up again. Sometimes you can reconstitute your paint a little bit with a drop of linseed oil too. Press and seal. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, press and seal. That stuff works great. So you might try a couple of those things. Just see what works for you. I don't have a freezer in my studio, and I just have a large glass palette. Sometimes I will take it home, but I often end up forgetting my paint in the freezer when I go back to the studio. So what I've been doing is taking a large Tupperware kind of storage box, and I just place that over my paint piles. It doesn't necessarily slow the drying time all that much, but it keeps dust from settling into my paint overnight. So that's why I do that. But I also sometimes use the press and seal if I have really large piles and I know I won't be in the studio for 3 or 4 days. Then I'll do that, and it really helps. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get to the critique. I hope that helped answer some of your questions. So what I would suggest, and I don't know if you plan to glaze over this like some of you might want to once I get that video. But what I would suggest is definitely work on bringing your values up. Now, I can't tell if it's just the photo, Lori, or if, you know, I don't know when it looks, when you see it on the screen, is that how bright your painting feels in person? Or is the photo just a little bit dark? because I don't want to tell you to correct something if it doesn't feel like it does in real life to you. Because I can adjust some of the brightness. Here. So yeah, I can't quite tell if your painting is more like that, or if it's more like this. I get the feeling like it's a little brighter. So is it a little bit brighter like, let me see, maybe a little bit more like that? Or is it darker like that? I know sometimes photographing can be really, really hard. It's hard to tell. Okay, well, I'm going to kind of bring it just up a little bit. And then, and I'll go based on that. I know it's really hard to photograph paintings in particular. I always have a heck of a time with it, especially with higher contrast work. It's easy for it to lose some of the detail, either in the lights or in the shadows. And what I tend to do is I try to shoot for kind of the lights, the mid-tone light areas, and make sure I have the right range there. And if my shadows get a little dark, I'll do an underexposure for that one too. Or sorry, an overexposed one for the shadows, and then a slightly less exposed photo for the lights, and then I'll merge the two. If you have a camera that can do the HDR, I think is what it's called, where you can layer, you can get a little bit more of an accurate one. But it's really tough to get all the detail, but you definitely don't want, areas to be blown out. Okay. So I'll actually make it go back to the original photo. Okay, that way I can go based on where you are in your painting as well. So what I would suggest is starting, and that's okay to build the light slowly. All paintings are built dark to light, so in oil, so that's okay to start off that way. What I would suggest is starting by establishing, let me get on the right layer. Starting by establishing a little bit in your lightest light. Get those specular highlights to the value that they should be, or a little bit lighter if you plan on glazing color. So by really hitting those areas with the intensity that they are in the reference, and it could be that maybe if you're working from a printed reference, maybe your print's a little dark, so that's something to take into consideration. I always want my skin tones to feel like they're glowing from within, so I tend to really push those light values, but that doesn't mean everywhere gets really, really light. Value control is really, really important in getting a painting to feel luminous. So a good example of that would be not making the highlights in the hair as bright as the highlights on the face. By doing that, you're controlling the setting for how the skin tones are perceived. So you'll notice in a lot of my work, the backgrounds are darker, at least by a little bit, than the skin tones. And that's one of the ways to get the figure to feel like they're glowing. It's not about brightness per se, but about selecting the right values for the appropriate areas. So if you go in and you find because your drawing is really beautiful. So I don't want you to feel like you have to repaint the whole thing. But if you just went in and just start by hitting these lightest points, right? Whites of the eyes, maybe just a little bit. Pushing a couple of those values. She has a little bit more of a brightness to this area here. So it's always easier to start with those specular lights and get those nice and bright, near white, almost white. So you'll notice here's pure white here on the palette. You'll see near the gray. And notice that the cream color that I'm selecting here is a slightly darker value. That's what I mean by near white. It's almost pure white, but it still has some color to it. And that's because we're painting skin tones. If we were painting a white object, that might be different. We might use pure white in a few of those select areas. Okay, so looking at the broader areas, and if you just do a little bit of a scumble, your underdrawing will still come through those values like you see in my demo video. Sometimes I'm just kind of lightly scumbling over some of those areas. So what I would do is go through and hit those areas that you know need to be pushed just a little bit. Starting with those brightest lights. Okay, then what I would do is go in and work on transitioning those. But you don't have to, like I said, you don't have to do it everywhere, all over the face. If you want to just work across the forehead, start there. If you only have time to do the forehead for one day, then don't lay in these without being able to blend them out. Just work across the forehead, but start at the center of those brightest highlights and then scumble out from there. I'm going to pick a different brush. This one is leaving a strange pattern. There we go. So doing a little bit of a scumble, you might find that you need to push some of these values over, but there will be a point when you feel like you reach where the values were correct, and then you just kind of fade that off. Take out some of the width of that highlight there. And then, again, proceed through the other parts. And scumbling is one of a very good way to do that without having to retile the whole painting. So a little thin veil of light, even over the light portion of the nose, just a little bit. So I'm basically scumbling over this to make it, just bring it up in value a little bit more. I can't be as precise as I could if I were painting over this physically with oil, but you can kind of get the idea of how that's going to build luminosity in the face. And my soft brushes have rounded out her face a little bit too much, but I think you have the drawing there, so kind of keep with that structure, but don't be afraid to bring everything up a value step. I think you have the right amount of detail in the eyes. This far left eye, it's really close. I feel like it just needs to open up a little bit on the top lid. So what I would suggest is just bringing that more open there, and you'll have to just raise maybe the dark for the lash line up just a little bit. And maybe her eyebrow got also a little bit thick here on this side here. So notice that where the fullness to the brow bone sits, so like right here, and right where this starts to curve, the eyebrow actually arches up and over that on a female, typically. And you notice how she has this nice kind of angular arch here. That should be happening on this side a little bit more too. So what I would suggest is taking a little bit of the tone that you have here and just bringing that arc up a little bit, and that will help open up the expression on that far eye. Yeah, I think actually your temple seems pretty good. Maybe just in this little area it needs to lighten up just a little bit, but everything else looks really, really nice. I think you'll want to go in once you've lightened up the rest of the face and hit some of the lights in the eye socket a little bit. Again, relationships change as soon as you introduce a new value. So since you're building gradually dark to light, you might find, okay, I need to go in now and just make sure you're not scumbling over your shadows. But you might see, oh, now I need to go into some of the features and just bring some of those values up. I really like the warmth that you have here in the shadow mask. That's really beautiful. I think it plays really well. So all we need to do is just work on bringing up those light masses a little bit brighter. Okay, yeah. So you could even let the painting dry and then make that correction in the eye. I know with the timeline, it's like a kind of a waiting game too with the paint drying. So do you have any other questions? You have a really beautiful painting here, so I just want to see you bring some of that luminosity in the face. And then it's really just gonna pop, and you will be able to add some color without it getting too dark. But do you have any other questions? All right, so if you have any follow-up questions, just go ahead and send them to me as you continue working. Perfect. All right. Yeah, really beautiful job. All right, Jackie, you are up. And I think you said you had a question about the left eye getting a little bit off in your drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and address that first. All right, Susan, we'll see you later. Thank you for tuning in. And when you finish your painting, like if you keep working on it, post it on our Facebook page. I'd love to see. And that goes for everyone. If you guys continue working on your paintings and you get it to the point where you're happy, go ahead and share it on our Facebook group. I will keep that group live. I kept my old charcoal one for my charcoal class live. And so I'm going to keep this one live as well so we can all kind of stay in touch with each other. Oh, you don't have the link for Facebook, Susan? Email me and I'll send it to you. And then you put in a request to join the group. I thought you were in the group, but the painting group for the class. But yeah, just email me and I'll get you the link. Okay, Jackie, so you said, is the right eye too big? Okay, so you know, I don't think the opening is all that too big, but I feel like the angle that we see here. So let me do something real quick. I'm gonna just bring that a little closer to the reference here. So let's look at that. My feeling is that it's more in the angle that you see here, right? And yours is more like this. So you have like an arc like this, and hers is actually a little more angular like that. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit because obviously this side is rounded, but this angle should be a little more flattened. And so what I'm thinking is that if you actually brought that angle down, here, let me grab a darker color. That you can see. So if you actually brought it down like that, and that might mean that you need to bring down some of the mid-tone in front of the lashes a little bit. That's starting to take on her eye shape a little bit more. Let's see. That might also give you some of the room that you needed to bring the crease a little bit further down for her eye. I'm going to draw it in dark, but obviously the way you've painted it is fine. The value you've painted it, it's just a little bit high. And so that should, let me do this on a new layer. I'll do it in a darker color. So yeah, I feel like it's all you need to do is kind of straighten out this section and then bring that tone in a little bit here. And then your crease for the lid should be maybe a little bit more like right there. You have it right here. And part of that was probably because this was too high, so you pushed the line up as well. That will also give you a little more room to round out some of the fullness in that brow. You see this kind of teardrop shape that's happening there, and yours is more skinny like that. So you could actually open up the light shape a little bit more here. And that will help. It also looks like your eyebrow maybe got a little bit long here, so I would look at the angle relationship here between the eye and the edge, the corner of the brow. Before yours is like this, right? And I think it should be more like, maybe more like that. So that's going to make a big difference. And all you'll have to do is take some of this color and just shorten it, paint over it a little bit. Not by very much, and that'll do the trick. And you'll have to shorten up the light shape here as well. Don't carry it so far over. And you'll see that she has this little shadow shape. It's almost a semi-shadow shape like that. It's like another teardrop. It's like we have two teardrop shapes coming together. So I think if you took a little bit maybe of the darker color and brought in a soft shadow there, a little more shadow as that lid turns away, then you'll start to get that feeling to her eye shape. Does that make sense? Let me get that little teardrop shape there. It's very soft, but it should be a little bit shorter, and that should give you, you know, a little more of her eye structure. With the left eye, I think it's about finding some definition in this underplane here. And what you might need to do is take a little bit of a mixed value, maybe something close to that value, something with a little bit of opacity in it, and just create some reflected light on that underside of the rim where we can see the water line, you know, the underside shelf of that eyelid, because that already kind of helps foreshorten the eye. And don't be afraid to make that a little bit more pronounced and simplified, because I know in the reference it kind of feels more broken, but I would just simplify it a little bit. Looking at the shape here. So maybe this part too, when you reshape this, don't be afraid to open that up just a little bit more. And then her lashes will kind of come out from there, but I tend to put them in just almost like a soft dark shape at first, and then I pull out a few of the little hairs to define some of the individual lashes. You might find this space getting a little squeezed. I would maybe push that out just a hair, not by very much. So let's see what the difference looks like there. Yeah, so let me do a little bit more of a paint over on this eye here. So by the time you soften that, and get that shadow a little darker underneath the little cast shadow from the eyelashes here, it will start to look a little bit more like her. I think that bottom lid too, I can't tell because the resolution on this picture, but it's very similar to the way this one, it has like that flat kind of angle. This eye does the same thing, but not exactly above. Yeah, it's slightly to the right. I think actually all you would need to do really is pop this edge a little bit more. Leave this one here a little softer. Just pop this one to bring it forward a little bit more in front of the iris. And that should pull everything together for you. Did you have any other questions on other areas? Now I realize you haven't probably gotten into this area. Your reflected light in here looks really nice. I think I'm just looking at the spacing here and like here. You're really close. I think what I would do is maybe glaze that forward a little bit through this section. And it kind of bounces back. You have it kind of dancing up there. Her chin feels maybe a little bit short. I would maybe just maybe mix this mid-tone here and just bring it down, oh, about that much. It's not very much, but it will kind of open up her chin a little bit more. And that might mean that you need to, you know, re-wet your core shadow color a little bit to be able to blend that edge. But I think it needs a little bit more of an opening to the light mass. That way her chin doesn't feel like it got too small. It's subtle. I'm just looking between the two. Yeah, like if you'd taken maybe that darker color forward just a little bit, and then maybe carry that back just a little bit. She has very subtle planes on her face. It's easy to kind of over exaggerate. Actually, one thing that will help is, sorry, that was too big, is this area here is a little light for that section. What you want to remember is that the face, the muzzle kind of has this little kind of connection here, because remember it's also a sphere shape, so this is like a ball, right? And the highlight's going to be up here, but this is curving away from that light. So as it comes down, yes, we have these little lights and a little bit of form modulation, but if you just kind of added a little bit more of a gradient there, it's going to help make that a little bit less severe. So you're asking, can you glaze with umber over the light areas? Yes, you can. It's going to have a little bit of a different look. It's going to warm it up, because remember, glazes tend to warm, and it's going to darken it. But what you can do, kind of instead of just applying a mixed value, is you can glaze. Let's say you pull your glaze here, like in this area, out, and then you can paint back into that glaze, pushing the other direction with the whatever value is here, to help bring a little bit more opacity to it, and that will help you blend your edges. Yeah, and it will happen. So glazing, the umber is going to warm it. Scumbling is going to cool it, and that's part of the reason why in that final video, instead of just carrying my scumble out too far, like let's say I started scumbling here and then I started getting to a certain point, it started taking on a bluish cast. So that's when I switched to scumbling with my mixed value. So I might go from using, you know, this value here to using, you know, maybe not that one, but this value to scumble here. Of course, those colors are very different from what you have, so don't worry about that. But that gets, you know, you're still scumbling is more the technique, not so much the fact that it's pure white. You can use a mixed color to scumble. It's more about, it's a thin semi-translucent veil or application of a white mixture or a slightly opaque mixture over a darker area. A glaze is applying a dark transparent layer over a lighter area, for example, and that always makes it a little bit warmer. Yeah, and it can be a little jarring. I mean, it can make it not feel cohesive. So that's something to keep in mind. Glazing for your shadow is fine, but going in and if you like, for example, now one thing you could do is once you've seen how to glaze color, some of those slight differences might not show up too much in the underpainting or in the final painting. If you, for example, were going to glaze a flesh tone over all of this, it wouldn't have as much of that jarring kind of difference. But you definitely want, for the technique I'll be showing everyone in the glazing video, is, you know, you definitely want a feeling of cohesion and like finished quality to the light mass especially. We don't typically glaze the shadows unless it's needed in the final color layer. We're going to leave it this color. Where we'll be glazing color will be in this section. Yeah, so you don't have to carry your white this lightest mass. I would carry it over maybe, you know, like let's say I was going to brighten this area, I'd carry it over maybe that far, and then I'd switch to a step down. So it's kind of like you're tiling, but you're just adding really thin layers to bring the value scale up. And then there might be a certain point where you feel like, oh, I reached the right value and I can stop my scumble here. And your paint, you just kind of let your paint run out or fade into the oil that you used to lay down when you oiled out. Okay, so let's see. I would focus on the eyes. Now, let me look and see. Yeah, I had accidentally covered up some of the mouth here. The corner of the mouth. That seems good. This here might be a little bit dark for that section of her mouth. But if you just took a little bit of a scumble and just went over this section here, it would still show that little mid-tone, but it would brighten it up just a little bit. You'll get some of her character into her lower lip a little bit more. Okay? All right, really nice job. I think it looks beautiful, and you just need to bring some of those elements together and focus on those eyes. And don't be afraid to even go in with semi-opaque colors, because she has lighter kind of hazel colored eyes. So don't be afraid to add a little bit of reflection in those far sides on the other side of the pupil. You can create that effect by darkening the pupil, but I feel like you could actually enhance it and make it a little bit lighter to get the eyes to sparkle a little bit more. All right, do you have any final questions? Awesome. Okay. Well, really, really good job. And if you bring it to a finished, please post it on our Facebook page. I'd love to see it. And also that goes for when I send you guys the glazing video for color. If you happen to do it on your painting, I'd love to see the results. Or even if you just glaze, like if you're scared to go into your painting after doing all this work and cover it with color, paint like a little sphere using the grayscale, and then do like a flesh ball, glazing the flesh tones in the same kind of pattern, just so that you can get a little bit of experience doing that. Okay, Susan, it is your turn now. Okay, so all right, your painting looks really lovely. I don't think you had any specific questions that you had sent me in an email. My only suggestion really is, does your painting look kind of this dark in person? I'm not talking about the shadows, but more the light masses. Or is it a little bit more lightened? It's a bit brighter than it photographed. Okay, so I'm going to bring that up a little bit. Okay, yeah, I think if I just bring that up just a touch. Okay. So do you think you're going to put some color over this, or are you going to just kind of leave this as it is? Are you thinking of glazing some color into it later? Okay, all right, good. So what I would suggest before you do that is to just do a very faint scumble of the white or near white. I would say just a little bit closer to white than maybe your lightest mixture, and just hit a little bit here and a little bit in here. And that's just so that the colors don't darken the painting too much. Kind of just through this section here. Am I doing that? Nope, I'm doing that directly on it. Hold on, let me do that in a new layer real quick. Okay, so yeah, just mostly concentrate here. And what that's going to do, so when we do get into the glazing, some color, we're going to be putting kind of like this amber tone, and we're going to, especially in the cheeks, we're going to be adding some pink tones. So you might just consider looking at that triangle shape and that, you know, that angle there, and just build up the planes a little bit brighter. It doesn't need to be maybe even as extreme as this. Maybe something more like that. It's just going to help it glow, because the glaze that we're going to be applying will darken the end result. So just don't be afraid to push that. And if you push that up a little bit, you might end up just adding a little bit on that left side as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't have too many suggestions for finishing. Like, I really like that reflected light you put in the eye there. You might consider lightening the tear duct just a little bit, again, because we will be glazing kind of a pinker color in there, and if it's too dark it might not show through. So don't be afraid to add a little more light in that one. Her eye does feel like it got maybe a little stretched lengthwise. So what I would do is just shorten that tear duct a little bit. Don't be afraid to let that edge get kind of lost, because her eyeliner kind of stops right through here, and then this is all fairly light and much softer when you step back. So I think if you did that, let's see how that looks. Yeah, it'll just soften that right eye a little bit more. Okay, so you're talking about this left side here. You tried glazing it because you thought it was too bright? Yeah, so if you glaze, it's going to warm it up. What I would do is, if you feel like it's too bright, I actually don't feel like it's too bright. It could be that it felt too bright to you compared to the right side of the face as it is right now when you're painting. But once you lighten up that right side, maybe the left side will feel like it falls right into place and you can kind of leave it. Just kind of feel that out after you've lightened this side of the face here. With regards to the lace, there's different things you can do to get the lace to feel a little bit more realistic. What I would do maybe is actually when we go into glazing, and I'll probably end up doing this on mine as well, is I would glaze an ultramarine blue over this and over these areas. Okay, and then when it comes down to the lace, you would almost do two types of glazes. The skin tone is almost like when the veiling is over the skin tone. I'm going to be giving everyone the full color versions of these photos. I'll upload those when I upload the color glazing video. So you'll be able to see where the skin tone colors are on her. But like this area, I feel like you would probably almost just glaze this with the ultramarine blue, and then the brown will kind of mix with the blue and make more of a black. And then you can go back in with a little bit of, well, you'll see in the video how I do it, but you can kind of paint back into your glazes sometimes to bring more light back into it. And then I think with the lace, you have enough detail. It feels really delicate. You could make some of these areas here a little bit thicker. Let me just grab a dark color. You know, you have this pattern here. You could just build it up a little bit thicker if you want, but I think once it gets darkened, it's going to stand out just the right amount. Yeah, I think you did a really beautiful job. I like this touch here, this little subtle semi-translucent shadow. it really helps the feeling, and seeing the shoulder through here, it really helps that feeling of the light passing through the netting and illuminating a little bit underneath, but it's, yeah, it's really, really nicely handled. I like that. The only question I had, this little spot here, is that like a glaze, or is that, does that show up in your painting? It could be that this area was just still wet. See that little red dot there? Yeah, your lace does not compete with the details in the face. It actually kind of supports the portrait, and it complements the texture that you have in the hair here, and then you have a little bit of hair here. So actually, it's kind of funny with portraits. It can be very easy to make something else pull away from the portrait. But think of it this way: if you had a big plain shirt and then a big plain mass in the hair, and then you had more of like the smooth, like maybe not plain isn't the right word, smooth. Let's just say really smoothly rendered shirt, really smoothly rendered hair, really smoothly rendered face. Then it kind of becomes boring and everything is treated equally. What I like about this is we have this nice texture here and this nice texture here. So what is different is the face. And that's why our attention is pulled into the face as well. Also, if you had created values down here, like if your lights behind the lace were competing with the face, if they were all really, really bright, then it would become a distraction. So I don't think you have to worry about that, because once you brighten up that face, it's going to pull our eyes in there a little bit more. That's the underpainting showing through. Okay, so yeah, that little spot there. If it stands out, you might just do a dark mixed value and just cover it, just because when you glaze the color over this, it's going to enhance that warm spot. So you kind of want it to feel like the rest of the portrait instead. So that way it doesn't come through. I've had those things happen. Glazing always enhances what's underneath. So if you don't have a nice smooth transition, when you glaze, it's going to jump out. Yeah, so you don't want that. So maybe I would just mix like maybe this value here and just apply it over that spot. What panel are you working on? Which one did you end up using? Because I see a little bit of the texture there. I'm just curious. Was it the Artifacts panels from Natural Pigments? Or did you prep the surface yourself? Yeah, I work on aluminum now too. I actually have quite a few paintings on wood, and that's what I have always worked on. But I recently switched to the aluminum because it's more archival, and it's also much easier to frame, and it's much lighter when you paint larger. So I'm really enjoying the surface. So you prepped it yourself with a roller. Do you? Yeah, I don't like canvas either. I used to paint on it, and there's some good ones out there, but I much prefer the surface of panel. So what did you use, acrylic gesso, or did you use an oil-based gesso, like an oil primer, or a lead-based? 3 coats of traditional gesso. Okay. Yeah, if you want a smoother texture, I always struggled with traditional gesso, acrylic gesso, I mean, getting it smooth enough for my own liking. And so now it does not interfere with your portrait. So that's good. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if you like a smoother surface, you might try using an oil-based primer. You don't have to use lead. And if you're kind of hesitant to use any kind of lead-based primer, there are ones that are non-lead out there. The one I really like is actually made by Winsor Newton, and I've used it for years and years. I've only recently switched to a lead-based because I'm switching to the aluminum, but this other one sticks to aluminum great. And so it's called Winsor Newton Oil Primer, You apply it with the roller, the same. I use the high density foam rollers that you use for like painting your cabinets. And what I like about the Winsor Newton as opposed to the Gamblin or some of the other brands is the kind of pimpling texture that you tend to get, that like kind of texture that you get like almost like wall texture. It settles out of the paint because it's oil based. So it's almost like after you apply your first coat, you come back like an hour later and the texture has kind of smoothed over a little bit. And it doesn't require nearly as much sanding. It's not really called oil-based gesso. It's called oil primer. I will post a link to it on our Facebook page. And I recently, like I said, I recently switched to the Natural Pigments lead one. I'm a little nervous about using the lead one because I will have to sand it, but I'm going to just try it out because I hear that the surface is superior. So we'll see. I might end up going back to my Winsor Newton. Who knows? So, but the other stuff, the Winsor Newton is made with titanium white. You still want to wear a dust mask when you sand it, of course. But the oil primer, it dries very quick too. It's like an oil alkyd base primer. Matt, you can buy the aluminum from, wait, where are you based again, Matt? Are you in the UK? Or are you in the US? Because that can kind of influence where you get it from. Oh, that's great, Susan. I need to find a sign guy so I can get some cutoffs for free. Okay, UK. Okay, let me think about that. Where you can get it. Because I order mine either from Natural Pigments or I will order them from, I want to say it's jerrysartorama.com. Now, he might do international shipping, so you might still be able to get them, Matt, but you can buy it's called ACM. It's aluminum composite panel, and they're really inexpensive. No, I mean, I'm not entirely sure about. You could try looking on Rosemary's website, Rosemary Brushes. I know she has some other alternative art supplies there. You could try Blix too. Blix might, I don't know if you have Blix in the UK online, but I would just order a few small panels and try them out. They're really great. And they're pretty inexpensive. Like I said, I get mine from Jerry's and, or it's Cheap Joe's. No, I think it's Jerry's. I'm pretty sure it's Jerry's Artorama. And yeah, you'll pay, I don't know. I'd bought some very large panels and quite a few small ones. And I have enough panels to paint for the entire year. And I think I only spent maybe $200 on all the panels. And I have more than I'll need for the year. So they're pretty competitive in terms of pricing with like a wood panel. The only downside is you have to prep them yourself. So yeah. All right, so beautiful job on your painting. If you have questions, please post it when you're done with the underpainting too, but also if you have questions before going into the glazing, once I get that video up, just reach out. Really good job. I know a lot of you were brand new to oil painting when we started this, so I hope you feel like it's given you a good structured kind of approach to not just oil painting, but oil portraits in particular. So, Angela, we are ready for you. I don't know if you're with us right now. I look forward to working with you again, Susan. It's really beautiful. And are you newer to oil painting? I think you said something like you're not as involved in oil painting as you are with your drawing. Susan. Oh, wow. First time. Well, I can tell you right now, my first oil portraits look nothing like your guys's. Yeah, I had no structure. My husband said his either. So you guys are doing fabulous. I'm really, really happy with that. Gilberto, I will be putting the glaze video up on your student login, and I will I'll see how I can do that. I'm also going to give everyone a link to download. That way you can just download it. Everyone should have access to the course through the student login until I think it's the end of December or into January. It kind of depends on when you purchased and when you had signed up. So yeah, but I'll be definitely giving everyone the download link once I'm back. Okay, so you guys will be able to watch the videos, but you'll still have access through your student login until the new year. All right, good. Okay, so Angela, let's get to your, I don't think you had posted too many questions, so I think very similar to some of the other portraits, my suggestion would be if you plan to paint over this or do some color glazes, I would say work on finding those brightest highlights and don't be afraid of pushing those to almost near white. If you glazed, I can kind of just show everyone what a glaze would do. If I glazed, let's just say that's close to transparent oxide red. So if I glazed a portrait as it is, oops, let me do a, yeah, that's working. Okay, it's not going to go that dark. This is digital, so it's kind of, okay, so let's say that's a faint glaze over the portrait that's going to add some color. Let's say I went in and glazed a little alizarin in the cheek, right, or the lips. You can see how it's darkening the painting gradually. So if you're planning to do glazes, you want your underpainting to be 1 to 2 steps brighter than the end result that you want. And that can be kind of hard to judge, but just think of like your brightest highlight, you want that near white, very, very close to pure white. And then everything else should step down for that. And it's not that you don't still pay attention to the value steps across the reference, but it's just kind of thinking ahead, and you can usually just fix that by doing a very, very thin scumble over those lightest points, especially for her. For example, she has these more intense highlights here. Let me grab a smaller brush. So you might start with those little areas first, and then, of course, down the nose. In these areas here. And like in the nose, for example, I think overall you could maybe lighten up the light mass of the nose a little bit, because when you glaze this edge of the nose here, it's going to get quite a bit darker. So, or like for example in the lip, the bottom lip could be pushed a little bit brighter, maybe not everywhere, but definitely through the center. And because it's going to get glazed with a pink. And I always find that, you know, if things are feeling a little bit dull compared to, you know, the surrounding values. So if I was painting someone with darker skin, I would either push my background even darker or I would push it lighter, because you don't want, you know, the average values kind of around the model to be the same skin tone. It's almost like if you dyed your hair the same value as your skin tone, it kind of makes you look bland. It's the same idea. So you either go lighter or darker. I think you did a nice job softening this area here. I still think some of the edges maybe are a little high contrast. So this plane here, is an upward facing plane, so it's going to catch a little bit more light. And so I think if you just kind of soften out some of that a little bit and soften out some of the sternum. She does have that, but there's maybe a little more of a connection here, and just giving it a little less focus because it can pull the eye down. Contrast and hard edges pull the eye. So you want to keep those contrasts and hard edges, a few more hard edges in the face. You know, I would say she has kind of a medium fair. She can be quite fair. It kind of depends on where, you know, the way she's kind of lit. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'd say she's medium fair. So to soften the paint, so for example in here, one of the ways to soften that effect would be just to lighten up this section, but leave this lightest one alone. So by bringing those two values closer together, from here to here, it will soften the effect. You can do that through a thin kind of scumble of a lighter value, kind of over this area here, or you can just mix the value that you need. So you would maybe make it more like the value you have here. Or like down in here. Just bring it up a little bit brighter. And then but you would want to oil out a little bit of I would oil out most of the area that you want to blend into. So just a little bit. So that way you can get a seamless edge there. So you wouldn't want to be dry brushing this tone over that. You would want this to be re-wetted just with a little bit of oil. That way when you take this lighter color and you're blending it into those darker areas, or into the lighter areas even, that it feels like it was all painted in one sitting. Same thing goes in the face here. Now, if I'm scumbling and I have my white and I brighten this up and then I'm realizing I need to now carry it this direction to the right, I might go one step darker than this lightest tone and use that to scumble over. That way it doesn't get too cool. But the scumbling, you're applying such a thin amount of paint. That's something that takes a little getting used to. Think of it as if you're just loading the brush with just enough paint to spread over a big area. So it's kind of like you're just touching the surface and really spreading it out thin until it runs out on the brush. So a lot of, I know some people are having issue with kind of a chalky feel. So if that's happening, that could be that the paint is too transparent or kind of not flowing off the brush well enough. I know some people are having trouble with that, but whatever color you've been using seems to be working. I don't know which white you're using, but or if you switched, because I know I told some of you guys to switch, but a thin veil of that light. But I wouldn't take this brightest white and carry it all the way over to that edge, because then it's going to take on a weird kind of milky look. You want to switch to maybe the next value step and then the next value step until you can get that edge to kind of fade away. Gamblin titanium white. Okay, yeah. So I think you could push those lightest values, concentrate on the forehead to begin with, and then just hit a few of those areas. You can see it just creates a little bit more of a glow. And it simplifies. Notice how the chest, when I kind of do the paint over, it really softens it and brings the attention back to the face. So that would be my suggestion, whether or not you plan to actually glaze with color, is to bring that finish there. And be careful about areas like this, where you have these razor sharp edges meeting the background. Take a middle tone maybe something close to this tone here, and you're going to just tile the edge and then blend it out. Just make it a little bit darker. And the same goes for here. You're going to find something that's between the background value and this value, and you're going to just put in a thin tile where the two come together. And you can even maybe achieve this with a glaze, but I would just do a mixed value because it'll be easier. And you can see how it softens the illusion of those shoulders, and it doesn't pull the eye so much. So in fact, that whole shoulder here could just be toned down just a little bit so that it doesn't pull the eye, and soften up that cast shadow a little bit more. I think it already is softer excuse me, than what it was, but I think you could push that a little bit more so it doesn't pull our eye too much. And careful about this sharp corner kind of look. You might want to just round that out just a little bit. Add a little bit of variety to that shape. And sometimes scumbling a darker mid-tone over that shadow edge just a little bit will help break up that sharpness. Okay? Really nice job. Do you have any questions? All right, well, if you have any, oh, would you need to add more details? I would concentrate on the lightning. I feel like you have enough details in the face. What I do feel like you need to do is work on a few of the edges. So pay attention to where edges could be softened, like I just showed you along the shoulder. Anytime you have a really bright edge meeting a dark background, like along here, for example, it's always a good idea to have a slightly darker mid-tone value, not a real hard line. It should be kind of softened and very, very thin. But if you add just that, see how it softens the head, the face where it meets the background? It should just slightly turn the form into that dark hair a little bit. So if you kind of did that all along this edge, you can see how that kind of softens and gets the face to feel like it's wrapping back. So what we're sensing is this side plane change, and also where that plane meets the background. No, I don't think you need to do the detail. So beyond the edges, I feel like the eyes have enough detail. Again, like something like that sharp edge, you might just make it a little softer, maybe make it a little lighter. You want to be careful about, having too, crisp of a point there, because it can be distracting. So you might take the color that's next to it and just scumble over it. That's the biggest part. So when you're working, you kind of go from shapes. So we worked on our kind of abstraction and the value pattern, and then you go in the shapes of the light and dark, and then you go into values. Okay, and that's where we're getting more finessed with getting the values right for those areas. And then edges and detail should come last. So focus on edges, because I feel like you have sufficient detail in the sense that you have specular highlights, you have crisper lines and eyelashes. So I would just say look at where edges can be softened or made a little bit more delicate. So for example, some areas where the cast shadow could maybe just, It should still be sharper than like a form shadow edge here, but maybe it doesn't need to be as razor sharp. And you can do that by just mixing a value that's in between here and what the shadow value is, and tiling it in and then just softening it out, blending it out. So that way it kind of fits in there seamlessly. So it's a subtle difference, but it will create more of that realistic kind of illusion. Do you see the difference there? So like here in the eye and the nose, that cast shadow and the edge of the face being just slightly softer. Okay, so yeah, good job. If you have any follow-up questions after this, just reach out to me. And yeah, before we get into glazing with color, you're going to want to fix all these edges that I suggested. So before when I release that glaze video, if you are not sure if it's bright enough, just send me an email with a picture and I'll let you know. And that goes for everyone. If you guys want to send me one final picture before you jump in and throw in some color, then just send me a picture in an email and I'll let you know. All right, good job. All right, Kim. Are you with us, Kim? I think I saw you in here earlier. There you are. Oh, you're very welcome, Angela. All right. Let me see. I don't think I wrote any specific questions from your email. Really beautiful job. I like your treatment in the hair here. That kind of wispy quality that you got. Just a quick question. Is your imprimatura this warm? Because I couldn't quite tell if that was just coming across that way in the photo or if I should maybe bring the saturation down a little bit. Oh, it is. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll leave it. I like to just check just in case because photos can be really hard to get. Okay. I think your painting is plenty bright enough, so I don't think. Oh, the painting in my photo on the screen looks lighter. Let me bring that down just a little bit then. Oops, wrong layer. How's that? Does that seem good? Okay. All right. Okay, so yeah, I think it seems plenty bright enough for if you were going to go in and glaze with some color. You might consider just hitting a few of those brightest highlights. I did notice that she has a little bit more of a pronounced highlight here on the opposite side of the nose, which helps the nose stand out a little bit more. So what you might do is take and add a little bit of a scumble here and just bring it right up to the edge of the nose there and get that plane to pop just a little bit more, and then it blends out into her cheek. And then you might find the same goes down in this area, especially right above the lip. there's always this rim here that gets a little bit more of a pop of light. There's a lot of shape, complexity in the shape around the mouth. So pay attention to some of those more subtle planes. So you can kind of see here, like there's this little light shape, and it's lighter here, and then it fades kind of as it comes down towards the corner of the mouth. But you can see this kind of lighter rim here, and that gets it to feel like it pops out a little bit more. And then she has this kind of mid-tone that comes here, but then there's this little light shape. So what I would suggest is just enhancing some of that a little bit. So you scumble. Hi, Diane. Welcome. So you said, let me catch up with some of the things you typed, Kim. So when you put your value scale on your lightest highlights, they're a value 4. Okay, so, and then you said you scumble with practically just pure white, but it always dries darker. So some of the drying darker could have to do with the lead white or the more transparent whites. That happens to me too, because they get more transparent as they dry. What you could try doing if it's becoming too much of an issue is to take the white that you're using and add a little bit of a titanium to it for that final pass for the lightest lights, and maybe mix a very, very small amount of the umber into it. Now, when you're painting, Kim, are you painting under the same light that your palette is under? So you want your mixing palette under the same exact light that your painting is sitting under. Because sometimes if you're mixing under a different value or brightness, light on your palette, and then you go to your painting, it can kind of throw off, your perception of those values. It's up right next to your painting. Okay. The most opaque white is titanium white. Yes. So lead white is more transparent, and it is true, lead whites do get darker as they cure, but it shouldn't be that noticeable. But if you put a little titanium in there, it should maintain that opacity a little bit better. And also, just something for everyone to note, lead white, if you stick your painting in the cabinet, let's just say you're letting it dry or you're putting it away and you have it stored in like an area that's dark, your painting will get darker with time because lead white kind of absorbs light, and it can kind of yellow or look darker. But as soon as you expose it to white, like sunlight, or it's the best not to have it in direct sunlight, but if you expose it to light over time, it will brighten again. So it's kind of bizarre, but the lead grounds will do that too. So I've taken my paintings out of a cabinet that have been in there for a year, and I'm like, man, they look so dark compared to what I remember them being. And then I set them out in the light for a week or so, and then they're bright again. So it's just the nature of lead white. So you're using Permalba, which should have titanium white in it, but it could be because it also uses zinc, and zinc is more transparent than lead white. So maybe in the next layer, use Permalba mixed with straight titanium for those brightest areas. Maybe use the Permalba as you're transitioning out of those light areas, like as you're getting closer to the midtones, switch to the transparent mixtures, but maybe mix one value that's, going to be a little bit lighter. Like I said, here's pure white, just as that's too big. So as a frame of reference. So I see what you're saying, it's more like a value 4. Let's see what this one is. Yeah, that's more like what you want. So I keep doing that. So you want something that's really close to white. it should be one step down from white. Okay, so try using the titanium because that will help. And then as you scumble over and over this direction, or as you're coming down on the face and you're putting the lights in here, you might switch back to that permalba, but still make the mixtures a little bit lighter. Experiment with it. I haven't used permalba, but I know a lot of people who really like it. So it shouldn't be too big of an issue with the darkening. Yeah, that's really odd. I mean, things can look different when they dry sometimes, like in the sense that we talked about sinking in. So like you have sinking in happening here, I can kind of tell because it looks kind of foggy, or you have it definitely in here. But I know when you re-wet that with oil, or if you re-wet that with, or when you went to glaze it, or you re-wet it with varnish, it's going to come back to that darkest value. So I can tell that's happening. But the whites darkening, the only thing I can think of is that they're becoming more transparent and letting that darker imprimatura kind of influence those upper layers. So just use a little more titanium in the mixture and it should solve that for you. Are you using any medium too? Like, are you using liquid or just oil or? And I do notice that when my paintings are dry, I'll come back, a couple days later, and they look a little more dull, like in the lights, just a little more dull. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say too much darker, maybe a little bit, but they really brighten back up as soon as I varnish. So you could try oiling out this area and just see if it looks lighter when it's wet. It shouldn't be maybe that drastic, a 2 or 3 step value difference, but try the titanium and see. Okay, that's good. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, so it could be that it's kind of drying more flat and matte. Also, because your shadows are drying a little bit lighter, it could change your perception of the contrast there too, a little bit. So you could try like re-wetting it with a little oil and see if it looks brighter. If that doesn't seem to do the trick, blot off some of that oil and just scumble a little titanium mixture in there, and that should do it. I don't really have any suggestions as far as the, other than just lightening a few of those areas and just softening this little corner there. I feel like it's maybe just a tad hard, and what I would do is just scumble the corner, maybe shorten it just a touch, but just do a light scumble over it, and then it'll feel like, because she has that little upturn there, but it's more of a mid-tone. It's not the actual crease in her mouth. And so if you just soften that a little bit and then maybe pop the highlight just beneath it, you'll get some more of that subtlety in her mouth expression. Yeah, I think as you scumble too, you might find, oh, I can lighten up a little bit here and there, but I think mostly up in the forehead and this far right cheek. Maybe a little bit on this left side, in the whites of the eyes, maybe a little bit. That way it's not drying too dark, and when you go in and glaze, it doesn't become dull, because the glazing will darken the end result. All right, so do you have any questions? Yeah, I think you really captured her eyes and her kind of expression, and I really like like I said, the treatment in the hair. Yeah, the brightening the whites. Okay, try that titanium. If you're still struggling, and you you know, feel like it's darkening further. I'm trying to think, like, I think the titanium white's going to do it for you. You could try using a more pure titanium just for those brightest light areas and see if that helps. But email me if you have questions or you're having difficulties. Or write on Facebook. I'm on there too. Yeah, really beautiful job. Do you think you'll glaze over it in color? I can't remember if I asked you this already. Because if you are planning to, you'll, well, not really. Well, so the next class that I'll be offering, we're going to go more into color mixing, skin tones, and that sort of thing. This is just going to be like a little bonus video at the end that I wanted to show you guys how you could take a grisaille and add a little bit of color as kind of, I don't know, like just a little extra something, because it's pretty fun to do. So I'll be releasing that when I get back from LA. I tried to film it beforehand, but with the holidays and also my cold, my voice was just really bad. I was coughing a lot, so I didn't want to have to cut all the coughs out of the video. So I'm going to do that when I get back on the 5th. I should have it to you guys by the 10th of December, the little glazing video. And just, I'll reiterate again, you want to make sure that you allow your underpainting to dry really well before you glaze. Part of that is for, you know, building a painting that lasts. You won't encounter any issues with cracking or anything like that. But also, if your paint layer is soft still, it can redissolve some of those finer layers when you add a medium on top, and then it'll mix in. So you want to make sure this is well dry. So give it a 2-week period to dry after you made your corrections, and then we'll go into some glazing. Yeah. I mean, in the end, but I've actually, you know, it's funny, you wouldn't think, but monochromatic portraits are quite popular for commissions. I'm actually doing one right now for the holidays for someone. So it's one of the great reasons to kind of learn this technique. But when I teach the color course, that's going to be, we're going to do an underpainting very, very similar, but we probably won't bring it to this level of finish because it'll take up too much time. And that's not really exactly how I work. I used to do this under every single painting, and it took me twice as long. And I don't do it, not because I don't think it has a benefit, but because I simply don't have enough time, and I would hardly turn out very much work if I had to do this and then repeat it in color. So this is kind of a stepping stone towards color, which is, yeah, our ultimate goal. So yeah, good job. And I look forward to seeing the painting when you add some color. Yeah, Matt. So same thing here. Actually, the commission I'm going to be starting here soon. And I've done these in the past too. It's actually an older photograph that's black and white, and so, you know, I'm painting it in the monochromatic. But they can be beautiful on their own. And there's several artists who actually work in monochrome with just a few glazes, and they kind of work that aesthetic into, you know, it's their style. It's kind of their signature style. So, and it works great. You know, they just add little hints of color here and there, but they're beautiful paintings because values are the foundation of, you know, a good painting. So, all right. So Janine, you are up now. And let me see, I didn't have any questions from your email written down specifically. Let's see. I think your values are plenty bright enough. Just taking in the whole portrait here. I would glaze down some of the highlights in the hair. I do like the texture that you have in the hair. It's really kind of rhythmic, and I really like it. But I think if you glazed it one last time, maybe with the burnt umber mix, it would kind of tone it back just a little bit. But you should still be able to see that texture come through. And I'd also work on softening the edge here. It's a little razor sharp. You could do that by just glazing a semi-transparent brown black in between. Not to widen it very much, but it will help to soften that area a little bit as it meets the background. I actually feel like it's okay to have maybe a found edge through the cheek, but maybe this area is kind of pulling my eye, so I would soften that out a little bit. Let's see. I think you have plenty of detail in the eye. This right eye feels like it got a little large. Very small amount. I think if you just took a little bit of light tone and just shortened this here by about that much, that's going to make it feel a little bit more like her eye. She does have that little flick of the lash and eyeliner a little bit at the end, but I think maybe when you had painted that in, it got a little bit too elongated. Also be careful about having like really sharp lines like you have right in here. What I would do is maybe glaze down a little bit of the whites of the eyes there and a little bit in that tear duct, just to soften that effect a little bit more. So you can see the difference that that's creating there. It's okay to have a specular highlight here in the tear duct, but maybe not so much of the hard line, and also just softening that, maybe simplifying how many highlights there are. And I do feel like the mouth is maybe getting a little stretched, and that could be because you were relating it to, you know, the outer corner of the eye. Same, very simple correction. I would just take this mid-tone and just paint over that and shorten it just a hair. Yeah, something like that. And you might consider popping a little bit more of a highlight just on the right side of this lower lip. Maybe not that bright, but just soften it out a little bit. And then same, like all of the values down in here start to feel kind of the same. So try to look for where there is some variety to the forms around the mouth. So for example, if you went in and just added a little bit of an accent here, a small one, make sure it doesn't spread out too far. And then you took, I'm looking at the reference here, and maybe toned this far side of the chin a little bit more. Just to get that, to push that form to turn. And then she has a very subtle little tone there. And those little details can really help to enhance the feeling around the mouth. Usually it kind of pulls out this way and then it pulls in that way from the corner. The way I like to think of it is if you had, I know it's really odd analogy, but if you think of this as like, let me draw it over here. So you have this this is the corner of the mouth, right? This is the lip. If you imagine like a donut, and here's the hole. I know it's a really weird analogy, but you're going to have light on this upper half and a little bit on the lower opening, right? And you're going to have it kind of carry over this way. But there will be a little bit of this shadow above that transition. And there's actually even a slight dark or mid-tone that comes down. Hold on. Let me just get the light tone. There's a light tone that comes down just like that, but then there's this little mid-tone form. So if I erased the outline, this is an exaggeration, of course, but if you look at it in that way, that concept, it can really help. It also helps to think of this whole muzzle as a ball, and you have the light up here, and then it kind of falls off and gets darker as it goes down. But sometimes those little visuals can help you see some of the more nuanced things that are happening in the mouth. So the main thing is to look for the little dark here and the little light here. And that will bring a whole other level of kind of structure to the area surrounding the lips. Because it's not just about the lips have to fit into the structure and planes of the face. Okay, those are my only suggestions. I think you have a really nice painting here, and it will look fabulous once you add, or if you're going to add some color over it. I think the values are plenty bright. Do you have any questions? I think you really captured the fall off of light coming across the form really, really nicely. So like you have this side much darker than this side. I think that reads really well. So that's why I wanted you to push the chin a little bit more that way. So you can see the difference here. It's subtle, but it's going to add, again, that just little extra touch to the painting. All right, Janine. Yeah, don't worry. I know, like with the holidays and everything, this time of year is always tough, which is why I'm not doing a class next month. That'd be insanity for everyone. So I appreciate you putting in the time yesterday, though, to try and get it to this. If you need a couple of weeks, and you got, like I said, I won't have that video to you guys for a few weeks, for about 10 days. You'll have plenty of time to kind of keep building your lights and rendering out and bringing it to a finish, and then letting it dry. You want it to dry at least, I don't know, I would say a week before you glaze from your last touches. That's just to ensure that when you glaze and you're using a medium to add your glazes, it's not going to lift up those very subtle, thin layers of white that you added towards the end. Okay, so yeah, really nice job. And if you have any follow-up questions, then just reach out. Thank you, Janine. Yeah, I'm really glad you enjoyed the workshop. Great. Happy holidays to you too. All right, Marina. I'm not sure if you are in class right now, but you had a couple of questions about softening hard edges on the left side of the face. So I think what you're talking about is this edge here, this cast shadow from the hair, I presume. So the best thing I could suggest is to take a value that is very close to the one that you have at this edge and do a thin scumble, a thin veil over that edge. Not to completely cover it, but just to lighten it and let it show through just a little bit, and that will help to soften that edge. You might have to blend that out with the next lightest value. And I can't quite tell if it's just the photo, but she looks very kind of tonal. And if you plan to glaze with color over it, I would just say don't be afraid to push those lightest values a little bit brighter, and maybe don't have so much contrast in some of these more subtle midtones. A very thin scumble can make a big difference, especially in these areas, because anything that you glaze over will be enhanced. So any contrast between like the highlight value and let's say this midtone here is going to be enhanced by the glaze. Oh, okay. Well, I'll keep your critique nice and short. Sorry to interrupt your cast painting course. Where are you taking the class at? The cast painting class? So yeah, that's pretty much my suggestion. I think that should do it. It's really a nice portrait. I think you could brighten up the eyes maybe a little bit, but don't be afraid to push some of those values. Yeah, her eyes are quite dark actually in this photo, but maybe just add a little touch just to bring a little more life and focus to the eyes. Not everywhere, maybe just on that left eye in this outer corner, because the light is on that kind of plane. And you can really get some sharpness to some of these highlights to add a little bit of textural variety. That way the painting doesn't feel too soft everywhere. Oh, okay, so you're at the Academy of Realist Art. Fantastic. No worries about the live critique. I mean, that's why I have them to where you can watch them later. That way, you know, I know it's hard to get everyone on the same schedule. So that's fantastic. I taught cast drawing for a really long time. It is not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of patience. So yeah, just maybe push the values a little bit, and if you're planning to glaze some color in after I show that video, you might consider just brightening this, or else she'll look a little more tan than she is. So just look at where you can maybe push those a little bit lighter. Maybe a touch on this right side. I like the fall off of light that you have, but if you brighten up this left side of the face, you might want to just push that right side a little bit. Yeah, and her highlight here on the nose. I think you have the right shape. I think you could push that a little bit brighter. And don't be afraid to go in and just add a few of those kind of real specular kind of glimmers. It's easily overdone, but if you just add, like, find a spot where you can push that kind of feeling, and maybe even a darker glimmer in the tear duct, it can add a lot more sparkle and kind of life to the eyes. Even if the photo, if it's more nuanced in the photo, sometimes I will enhance that just to get that wet feeling to the eyes a little bit. Yeah, so lead white, yeah, it'll take a little getting used to, especially if you're used to working with titanium. It depends on the lead white you're using, but if it's still going like too dark and you're struggling with that, then you could try with this final pass to mix a little bit of titanium with it. It depends on the brand you're using. I never find the need for that with my lead white that I use, the Natural Pigments Lead White #2, or if you go with the Blue Ridge brand, he has titanium white in his Flemish white. So it's kind of a mix of both lead and titanium. So you could always try that. But it does take a little getting used to. But I think your portrait's beautiful, so I would just do that. I like the way you treated the hair, so I wouldn't add much more highlights or touches to the hair. Just soften that edge along the face. As you can see, it will kind of bring a bit more luminosity and softness to that left side. Oh, you're using the Michael Harding. Okay. Yeah, that's a good brand, so it shouldn't... it should work pretty good for you, but if you're still struggling to get those lights to kind of glow, it's a lot of it's about building your layers maybe a little bit thicker in the areas that you want it to pop, like the highlights. Use a little bit more thicker application of paint too, can help. But as you scumble it out, of course, you thin it as you move across the form. All right, beautiful job. Get back to your cast drawing. Thank you for popping in for this last critique. And you can always jump in and watch it later and kind of catch the rest of the conversation, because I will be answering some questions at the end of our critique today. All right, sounds good. I look forward to seeing it. All right, good luck with your drawing. Okay. Catherine. Are you in here right now, Catherine? Okay, so I was trying to see if I had any specific questions. I know you had to work on it kind of late last night. I'm glad you're learning a lot. That's fantastic. Yeah, I always find that during critiques when I was studying, I always learned a lot because, you know, you hear new things with maybe another student's work that you might have been struggling with, but it didn't get addressed. And so it really definitely benefits everyone to join in on the critiques, which is why I let everyone attend if they want to, even if they're not in the critique group getting critiques on their work. They can, you know, anyone can come back and watch these. There's a lot of extra stuff we tend to go over. So Kathy, I know you said you were painting kind of late last night on this, and so did you have any specific questions? I didn't see any in the email. It definitely helped to brighten it, I think. And the only thing I would say is that this left side now feels maybe a little too dark, but you could easily go in and scumble a little bit of these lighter tones just in this upper half. It's a very tight area, but she has a little bit more light there, and I think you could even push a little more light into that plane in the eye socket around that eye to build the contrast around that eye. I don't think you went too light. I think it maybe feels that way because you have so much dark in the mid-tone area. If you went in and added a few more subtle hints of light, like she has a little bit coming in here, that's a little strong, but knock that back just a little bit more. But sometimes breaking up some of that mid-tone can help a little bit. And like I said, building this one here will make a difference too. And also sometimes if we soften things out too much and we don't have a few areas where those highlights can really kind of pop, it can also make everything like feel too white everywhere. So you might, did you put like pure white for these highlights on the nose? Or something close to pure white? It's hard to tell from the photo compared to the lightest value that I have, but I do feel like maybe you could go back in and revisit some of these areas with just a little bit more, but be more selective about where you're placing it. That's the nice thing about working with the more transparent whites, is that you can build gradually, and then you're just more and more selective about where you're placing, you know, those light areas. For example, on the nose or here in the forehead, but you're not placing it, you're not pulling it everywhere. You're just hitting those areas that need that extra push. So for example, in here and up here. And because of the semi-transparent nature of lead whites or zinc whites, each time you build that layer, it's kind of taking that under layer too into account. And so it just builds because it's showing through a little bit. So it kind of builds on itself. And if you're finding that you're not able to get bright enough, you could try using a more opaque color. But a lot of times our perception of value is very heavily dependent on the values relating to the figure. And if you have really, really, really dark midtones everywhere, right, and then suddenly you put on something that feels just even a little bit lighter, like what you did, suddenly it feels really, really high contrast between the two. But if you go back in and pop that highlight in those special, you know, specular highlights or in the areas where you get more of a glimmer, then the previous layer that you would put on doesn't feel nearly so bright. Does that make sense? So it's all kind of relative. So my suggestion would be go back in with one more layer and don't be, excuse me, don't be afraid to push some of those values a little bit more. But be more selective about where you're placing it. And use it as a way to add detail to some of the anatomy. So for example, around this little corner, by lightening that up, suddenly this midtone now plays a role in that illusion of the form of the corner of the mouth. Yeah, and you could do the same thing. Build up some of those highlights in the hair. Even if they look a little rough, you know, when you first lay them in, or a little bright, don't be worried about that. Ooh, that was too big. Because then afterwards you can take your brown and do a slight glaze over that, like that, and it's going to knock those back again. That's one of the reasons I build hair definitely in layers, because there's too much going on in hair to paint it in a single layer. I mean, it can be done, and usually when you do that, it's more simplified. But if you're wanting a more classical look and you want a little bit more of a finish to the hair, then it's better to build it in layers. And then I would just suggest making sure, let me erase and make sure I didn't cause, yeah, so I think that was just my paint over. So when you go in and define a little bit more light in this section here, in this area right above the eye, that will help to help the eye pop out a little bit more, is by bringing that little section of light there as well. I do feel like I can't quite tell because it's so dark, but I do feel like the iris felt a little small. So you might check that and just make sure it didn't get shrunk down too much. Nice job on the lace. I think that looks great. I would just be careful about making the arms all one value. If anything, do a gradient coming down to where the arms get darker as they kind of pull away from the light. And maybe lighten up a little bit here, and don't forget some little shadows from the lace on the skin. And that will help it feel like, you see she has these little shadow shapes. They're very subtle, but they will help to make it feel like the light is passing through, but it's kind of hidden by a little bit of lace. And it'll get it to feel like it's sitting on the skin. All right, do you have any other questions? Oh, you're very, very welcome. Also, when you're going into the hair, you can see that a lot of the edges in her hair in the photo are broken up by lights as well. So when you go in and you add some of your details, don't be afraid to add a few wisps of like light that break past this outline, and that's going to help the hair feel also more natural. And then you can always glaze that back down. Okay, good job. You're very, very welcome. Okay, that was everyone who was able to submit. So let's get down to a couple of the questions that were, that I think Matt, are you still in here? Matt had sent in some questions and I wanted to kind of go over them with everyone. He's been busy doing a commission, so he hasn't had time to catch up on his painting in the class, but I thought his questions everyone would enjoy hearing them. So now I already kind of talked about this. His first question was about what to do with your palette between painting sessions. And I do a little bit of both, Matt, but I said this earlier, I sometimes use the saran wrap to kind of squish out the air around. So there's different techniques you can use. The idea is to keep air from making contact with your piles of paint. You can also drip a little bit of walnut oil over it if you find that your paints are still curing too quickly before you stick them, or when you stick them in the freezer. So that's something you can try using, is walnut oil. It kind of is a slower drying oil, and I just put a drop over each pile. And then when I'm ready to paint, I blot up some of the excess oil. That way it doesn't get mixed into my paint, but it helps to, if I know I'm going to be gone for a few weeks and I want my paint to last. It doesn't always, but it does help. And it really heavily depends on the pigments you're using. Some colors take forever to dry. Titanium white is one of the slowest drying paints. So that's one of the many reasons I had everyone use a lead-based white is for this class, is the titanium also takes forever to dry. But certain colors, ivory black, alizarin crimson, they take a very long time to dry. So those might last better, but umbers tend to dry quickly. So if that's mixed in with your lead white, that could be why some of the colors are drying out. So you mentioned on a commission, if I were doing the painting I did in the demo, how true would I remain to the lace pattern on the blouse? And you mentioned I did a painting of the same model holding an animal skull. Yeah, that painting, A Cautionary Tale, that's the title of that painting. Would I give a general impression of it, or do I really try to be very accurate with the lace? Or is it a matter of how much the client is paying for a commission? It's kind of all of the above. It depends on the commission. If the outfit is really important to them, then I will paint it true to what I see with as much accuracy as possible. And I'll put a little bit more detail into it. But of course, I tend to charge more for that because it's more work. So clients who ask for a commission portrait with a very detailed interior or a landscape behind them, it costs more because it takes me more time to do. So if they have a very elaborate gown that they're wearing and they want it painted faithfully, then I do definitely increase my price for that because it's going to take me probably longer than the portrait itself, because I want to make sure I'm accurate with that. Especially, again, if it's something that's kind of crucial and important to the client, then of course I want to be as faithful to that. And also that goes the same for likeness. A lot of times in my personal work, there is a likeness to the model. Definitely, I aim for that. But with a commission, I spend a lot more time getting my accuracy. And so I spend a majority of my time actually doing the drawing. I work on that drawing over and over and over again until I'm happy with it. And even then, still later, I find myself making corrections because that's just the way things work sometimes. But with commissions, because likeness is 100% crucial, I try to get as close to accurate, representation as possible. So when it comes to lace and some of the fabric, it really kind of depends. And also on the kind of the painting. Like if it's a head and shoulder painting, I probably don't place as much emphasis there. But if it was like a 3/4 length figure and there's definitely more clothes to paint, then I spend more time with that. It depends on where I want the focus in the painting too. So your other question was, what have you found is the fastest way of improving your portraits? Is it doing a lot of portraits or taking a step back and having a bulletproof understanding of the skull and life drawing? And how would you recommend that you improve? How would I recommend that you improve after the class? I would say that the fastest way to improve your portraits is to draw a lot of them and practice the beginning of a portrait, the block-in. I don't think you were in my portrait class, Matt, but I talked a lot in, unless, I don't know, some people have signed up for it, like, kind of like on demand. But I do talk a lot about that in the early stages, really, really focusing on getting your accurate proportion. And yes, having an understanding of anatomy, the skull structure, and just head construction in general, like talking more about like generic head proportions and the like, planes of the head, that sort of thing. It's really, really crucial to helping you get more accurate, because the more accurate you can get your beginning, your start, the less correction and work you have to do later, especially when it comes to painting. I mean, that's true of drawing as well, but especially when it comes to painting, because painting just takes longer to do. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and if you're having to chase your drawing corrections because you sped through the drawing stage too quickly, it can be really frustrating. And so my biggest advice is spend as much time as you need on the drawing for a painting, and also to just draw a lot of heads daily, even if they're generic heads. Head construction, practice out of like the Andrew Loomis book, or just if you have like a skull, do studies of the skull, and do anatomical studies from, there's anatomy references. Just search on Google, anatomy or planes of the head, and you can draw from those references as well. Those make a big difference. And it's more about working with it so much that it becomes intuitive, to check your proportions. It's funny, when I first started filming the classes, I didn't realize how much I stepped back from my work until I had to watch the videos of me doing it, and I realized, wow, I'm actually doing the things I was told. But it's something I don't even notice anymore, because it's so ingrained in me to step away from my work and look at it from a distance, and to check my measurements, that it's kind of like building good habits. And so I'm happy I'm doing that, because it's something that everyone should do. step back from your drawing constantly to get a bigger picture, especially when you start working on details. But it's important in the beginning of the drawing as well, because that's, what's going to carry the piece. Think of it like a foundation. You're not going to build a house on a bad foundation, and you shouldn't render out your drawing on a bad start. So just practice those block-ins, and that's really what carries you the furthest. Think of it like mileage. You just got to do as many as you can. And even if they're not finished drawings, that doesn't have to always be the goal. It's, repetition until it becomes kind of your intuitive nature to approach things that way. And then you can focus on the more finite, small, nuanced things that you want to improve. But most of the time, as a teacher, I've noticed, especially in painting, I have people come in and they'll go, I know how to draw. I don't want to work on the drawing. I just want to start painting. But then we spend the entire painting correcting their drawing. So drawing issues. So it's important to remember drawing is that foundation. And I don't recommend anyone go in to a portrait painting class if they haven't had some experience drawing the portrait, because it's just going to be a frustrating experience for you and probably end up discouraging you. So it's better to just, be pretty confident in your drawing. Doesn't mean you have to be perfect at it by far. You just having, understanding the importance of the practice. I had a teacher that said, for every painting you should do, or every painting you do, you should do 3 drawings. And I think the emphasis there is just that you should constantly be drawing and sketching. Yeah, art is all about doing the miles. And you can read all the theory in the world, and you can have all the best books and all the best tools and everything, but if you don't actually sit down and do it, you're not going to get good. That's just, that's the reality, and you might have an eye for it, but you could look at someone else's work and see what's wrong with it, but if you don't sit down and actually practice, put the hand, to paper, and the same goes for painting. If you don't just practice painting and practice mixing color, then you're gonna not actually have the practical knowledge of it. You're not gonna have that practical experience. Susan, to answer your question, do I usually transfer a drawing to panel or start on my panel? I do a little bit of both, and it kind of depends on the painting. One of the reasons I had everyone transfer this time is because if you work on canvas, it can be really hard to draw with a charcoal. But what I actually like to do is I use a vine, or when I'm going to draw directly on the panel, I use a vine charcoal stick or a nitrum charcoal stick, and I will sketch on there, and I will draw the grid on the panel as well. Sometimes, not always, but usually when I'm trying to get a specific composition that I've designed, and my paintings are more when it's more complex, and I will use that when I do commissions as well. Very similar, same exact grid that you see here in our reference. So yeah, so when you do that, when you draw directly on the panel, there's a few things that you risk, which is damaging the ground too much. If you have to erase a lot, you can kind of burnish the ground of your paint, your painting panel, or you can end up stretching out your canvas if you're not working on a panel. So that can kind of be an issue, and also your drawing will wash away as soon as you do the imprimatura. So you have to find a way to seal that, and all that means is you go over it either in oil paint and you let that dry. I've also used watercolor over the lines, or acrylic, but you have to make sure you're working on an acrylic-based canvas to do that. If you're working on an oil-primed canvas, then you want to go over it in oil with just a thin brush. So the reason for doing a transfer is you have your drawing so that if something happens to your painting, you can just start again. You still have your drawing. I've had that happen to me a couple of times, so But for larger work, it's not practical for me to transfer. Like when I do like a 36 by 36, I just draw my grid and I spend a lot of time working on the drawing directly on the panel. So you can do it either way. But for the class, I thought it would be beneficial for everyone to have the ability to transfer, so that way if they lost their drawing or something happened to their painting and they wanted to start again, they can just retransfer the same drawing. Save some time. Okay, and your final question, Matt, was about when your painting is finished, what varnish do you recommend to seal it with? I actually recently had a varnishing nightmare. I know some of you might have seen it if you're part of the Painting Best Practices group. I had varnished a painting with a new varnish from Gamblin. I usually use Gamvar, but I usually use their gloss, and I would make it more satin on my own using cold wax. But I noticed last time I went to pick up some varnish that they sold a satin finish. So I thought, hey, shortcut. And then I applied it to my commission and nearly had a heart attack because when it went on beautifully. But when it dried, it had this milky, streaky look that just made me like lose my mind because it's a commission. And I was luckily able to fix that. It was partly that I had applied it perhaps a little thicker than I should have, and it doesn't show up so much when you do that with gloss, but if you do that with satin, apparently it does. Yeah, and it was a little scary, but I was able to fix it because Gamvar is dissolvable with Gamsol, the solvent that we use to clean our brushes. So I just re-wet the surface and kind of brushed it and stippled the surface with a dry, clean, bushy brush to lift and remove some of the excess varnish. And it worked perfect. So yeah, you can't see any of the streaks now. So I basically re-wet the painting and let the Gamsol dissolve some of the varnish. And then I removed some with a dry brush, just kind of stippling the surface, and it also broke up some of the streaks. Thank goodness my husband found an article for me on how to do that, because I was panicking a little bit. So I had actually tested this varnish out on a different painting before I put it on the commission, so I didn't think it would have an issue because it didn't show up that way in the little painting that I had practiced on. And but because that painting was on, I think that one was on a different type of panel, and this panel was particularly smooth, I think it pooled after I had brushed it on, and it caused those streaks. Yeah, I'm really happy I was able to fix it, and that's the one reason I use Gamvar is it's dissolved easily with Gamsol, and it should not affect your painting if you need to remove it, and it's easily removable. So don't use Damar varnish or like an old, that's what traditionally was used. It has Damar resin in it. Or don't use a retouching varnish. I don't recommend it because the chemicals, it usually has odorless mineral spirits in it, but also the Damar bites into your painting chemically, and it's much harder to remove. And if you ever have subtle glazes in your painting, that varnish will, if it for whatever reason you had to remove the varnish, it would take away those glazes too, which is just a nightmare. But luckily Gamvar is not that case. I was a little nervous about re-wetting with Gamsol, but it worked out just fine, so thank goodness. So I would recommend Gamvar. There's also a couple of other brands, like there's something called Regalrez Consuvar, sold through Natural Pigments. That's like a conservation varnish. There's also one developed by, I think, the National Portrait Gallery. That might be the Regalrez. There's another brand I know that Jeremy Lipking uses. I think it's like called CAS or something to that effect. Because I think it's conservation art something. I'll have to check. He had posted it a while back, so I might give that one a try. But I've been just using Gamvar so far. Yeah, I usually use the gloss, but you know, I didn't really like the Gamblin gloss. I'm much more of a satin finish. I prefer the satin finish. So what I was doing was taking the gloss, and I'd take cold wax medium and dissolve it in a little bit of Gamsol, and then pour that into my gloss, and just make sure it's shook really well, and that you've gotten all the pieces of wax that didn't dissolve. So run it through like a little piece of cheesecloth or something that can catch the chunks of wax that didn't dissolve, so it doesn't end up on your painting. And that works great too. So that's probably what I'll stick to. But you can try their satin, but the trick with Gamvar is to apply it very, very thin. And you kind of scrub it across the surface. So you want to make sure with varnishing, always make sure your painting is very, very dry. Gamvar, they say that you can apply it so long as the painting is like hard to the touch dry, which means if you press your fingernail into like a thicker part of the paint, it doesn't leave a dent. It's bone dry. You don't actually have to wait 6 to 12 months, which is what is usually recommended to varnish. So Gamvar can be applied before then, so long as it's bone dry or touch dry. Okay, so Dominique, you said you missed the part where I explained how to keep the mixed paint with walnut oil. Do you cover paint in plastic, put it in the freezer? Oh, either one. You don't need to cover it with plastic. The walnut oil is like an alternative if your paints are drying out on you really badly. You don't mix it into the paint. You just place a few drops on top of your piles before you stick it in the freezer, and it kind of coats the outside of your pigment. Just make sure you soak it up with a rag before you start painting again, the excess oil. All right, so does anyone have last minute questions for me? I will have that glazing video for you, like I said, by the 10th of December. If I can get it done sooner, I will, but I won't be back until the 5th. I'm leaving tomorrow, so. But if you guys, I will be available on our Facebook group if you guys are continuing to work on your painting and you have any last minute questions that pop up. Oh, you guys are very welcome. I wish I could have gotten it done sooner because I was planning to get that to you guys today, but you know, life happens. So I will have that for you guys soon. Oh, so if you guys are wanting to glaze, yeah, let me talk about that, Dominique, really quick. If you guys want to glaze along with me, the colors you're going to need are some transparent. I'll post this on our group too, or maybe I'll send an email out. But you're going to want transparent oxide red, or transparent red oxide. You'll want alizarin crimson substitute. I don't use alizarin crimson because it fades. It's a fugitive color, so I use either anthraquinone red or quinacridone red. It kind of depends. Some are a little bit cooler, some are a little bit warmer. You might want a little cadmium, even though it's a cadmium red, even though it's opaque. I'm trying to think if I'll end up using a little bit. Sometimes I like to mix that with the alizarin to get a warmer red. And you'll need just a little ultramarine blue. And that should be it. So just a primary palette for the most part. The transparent red oxide is very much an orange, but if you have transparent orange oxide, that could also work. And you'll definitely want some medium, like liquid. Oil does not always work the best for glazing because it tends to bead up over the surface sometimes. So having a good glazing medium will make a big difference. So make sure you have some liquid or another one that has some kind of dryer in it. You can use the Neomegalp, or if you have questions, just if something you have will work for glazing, just message me. You're welcome, Diane. Thank you for joining the class. Thank you all for joining the class. This has been a lot of fun. And I hope to work with you guys again in the full color class next year. I'll have announcements on that later. You're very, very welcome. All right, guys. I'll see you on Facebook then. All right. Good luck with continuing on your paintings. And also post them. I want to see them once you guys are finished glazing and all that. All right. Bye, guys. Take care. And happy holidays.